Please welcome to the stage Director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, Mr. Roger Zakheim.
Colleagues get a bonus for the applause. You win. Well, good evening, everybody. I am Roger Zakheim, the Director of the Reagan Institute. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the individual who's going to introduce tonight's program. So as I intro the intro, I figured I'd speak about the person who will introduce our special guest this evening. One of the things I love most about the Reagan Institute is our Scholarly Initiatives program. And I especially love the way we arrived at the Scholarly Initiatives program, which was a visit to George Washington University, the office of a professor who may have been the only Reaganite in, forget about George Washington University, probably all of Foggy Bottom. And in that loving and intense way that really captures the wonderful Professor Henry Now, set me on a course that we were going to set up an important arm of our work here at the Institute, where we do what President Reagan wanted us to do when he established the library, which is to be a place where scholars interpret the past. And it is with just tremendous pride and excitement that we are seeing the fruits of that first conversation, Henry. Our own Director of Scholarly Initiatives published his book from his time here as a first class of visiting fellows, and now the second book is published from the first class of visiting fellows with Professor Luke Griffith's book, Unraveling the Gray Area Problem, which you'll hear a lot about in a moment. But I did just want to take this moment to thank Luke for coming back and for his tremendous accomplishments from his time here and what he's done since, and especially to thank Professor Now for not making it a one-off in that conversation, for sticking with us, and now, of course, serving as our distinguished scholar here at the Ronald Reagan Institute. So, Henry, over to you.
Roger talks like that, says such the nice things. I always want to give him more time. You know, for all of us, it's a great day when we launch a new book, especially for those of us here at the Reagan Institute, because here we honor a president who loved to read. He taught himself to read, or he started reading when he was 5. And then from and took out a library card in the Dixon, Illinois library, and would visit it at least once a week, in many cases twice a week, in Dixon, Illinois. He wrote about his love for reading, and here let me quote what he said in a letter to Marjorie Flower, dated March 18, 1974. His letters are marvelous, by the way. You can't, you have to read them to appreciate them. Anyway, here's what he said, quote, "I'm one of those who remembers vividly the magic of a library. I prowled up and down the rows of shelves before making my selection. Thank heaven I learned the exciting world to be found in books. Reading is a magic carpet, and you can never be lonely if you learn to enjoy a good book," end quote. Well, today we launch a good book, and Ronald Reagan is not lonely. So I'm not going to go into detail on Luke's accomplishments. You can look those up. He's currently, of course, a professor at New Mexico Junior College in New Mexico. But I am going to note the fact that this book took him some 10 years to write. And that's the kind of sort of intense research that we love, we academics, and that turn out the books that really are lasting. To give you some idea of what those 10 years were spent on, in this book you have something like 105 pages of text. 155 pages of text. And you have something like 101 pages of notes, of references, of bibliography. And that speaks well of how thorough this particular study was done. By the way, I should just mention that Luke's faculty advisor, is with us tonight. He was the one who had a lot to do with inspiring Luke. And Chet, we're delighted, Chester Pack, we're delighted to have you join us for this evening. Now, what I'll say, though, about Luke and the gentleman, Anthony Eames, who's going to interview him here in a couple of minutes, is that they were the first, as Roger indicated, the first two young scholars to receive the Reagan Postdoc Fellowship back in 2020. Now, Luke launches his book today. Anthony did so in a similar gathering last year. And Luke fulfilled the only requirements that we imposed on his work. First, that he revise his dissertation on Reagan and publish it as a book with a prestigious academic press. Well, he did that. Cornell University is one of the most esteemed publishers of first books by young historians, probably in the world. And second, we asked that he scour the Reagan record in Simi Valley and elsewhere in making his study, plowing through the voluminous files that are now available on Reagan and revisiting some of the erroneous instant history commentary that plagued the early coverage of Ronald Reagan. Well, Luke did that as well, changing his mind, I suspect, in a few instances about Reagan's record. What did he learn about Ronald Reagan, both good and bad, that he didn't know before? Well, that's the kind of question that we're going to get into right now, as soon as this professor shuts his mouth. But let me take this moment then to turn it over to Anthony Eames, who is the Director of Scholarly Initiatives here at the Institute. We used to, when I was a young man like Anthony, we used to say, I turn the floor over to you. Well, now we have to say, I turn the floor over to you and the internet, since we have online guests as well as in-person guests. Anthony, it's all yours. And
well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here tonight. It's always good advertisement to make sure there's a copy of the book right here up on our table. And this is we'll try not to get sentimental, but Luke and I were fellows together in that challenging year of COVID while the Institute offices were closed, not yet open to the public and not yet able to do these types of things. So Luke and I saw fit to make our own connection and dig into the things that we thought were important on my porch, drinking coffee every other week. So this is just going to kind of mirror that conversation of sharing a cup of coffee or tea, or at frustrating moments, something a little stronger, talking about the kind of nuclear issues of the 1980s, right? And a second round of thanks to Henry, to Roger, to Chester. This is a bit of a reunion for you today, it looks like. I see a number of Ohio University Bobcats. I guess a reverse commute from the totality in Ohio. So Luke, let's get into it. Mm-hmm. Any good book talk we want to learn about? Why did you start working on this? What's the genesis of the book? And then also, this is a pretty smart audience, but INF is an acronym that needs unpacking. So what are the contours of the controversy? What are the turning points?
Sure.
What are the moments that matter?
I started the project as a graduate student at Ohio University, working with my esteemed advisor, Dr. Chester Patch. And what really inspired me to work on the issue was, one, I was interested in issues related to nuclear weapons and arms control. And two, at the time, there had not been a complete study going through the U.S. role in the dual-track decision from its implementation in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan to when it was devised during the Jimmy Carter administration. So I wanted to fill a gap in historiography. And what the story really begins with the Soviet deployment of the SS-20 intermediate range ballistic missile in the 1970s and 1976. It was a weapon that traveled about 5,000 kilometers, which meant that it was excluded from SALT, the ongoing talks about strategic nuclear forces. And this created a problem for the United States and its allies because they didn't know how to deal with this weapon at the time in the 1970s in arms control talks. And from a military perspective, the SS-20 was an intimidating weapon. It had 3 warheads that could target different things. MiGs with a range of 5,000 kilometers. It could wreck every single military installation in NATO Europe within minutes. In 1981, U.S. strategists predicted that a mere 100 SS-20s could get the job done. And by the mid-1980s, there are over 400 of them deployed on both sides of the Ural Mountains. And to make it more complicated than that, Western strategists were skeptical that they could track and destroy these missile launchers in the field. They could move quickly after being launched. They could move around the Soviet Union's robust territory. And this created a military problem that bleeds into the political element, which is that U.S. extended nuclear deterrence was questioned by NATO allies who wondered, is the United States going to fight for us given this particular situation? And it leads to the Carter administration and its NATO allies announcing the dual-track decision in December 1979. It calls for the deployment of 464 ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe, 108 Pershing II ballistic missiles, as well as simultaneous arms talks with the Soviet Union. And those eventually lead to the INF Treaty with President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Soviet Union, signing it in December 1987.
All right, so that's the good overview. Now let's get into the real substantive arguments that you make. You pointed out that when you started working on the book, there had not been a full-length study on the INF issue. Now, fortunately for us, there are now several books that in some ways grapple with INF. A number of our friends who we'll have to shame for not being in the audience here tonight. And we don't need to name drop for this group, but tell me a little bit about, your book does stand out. It does make an argument that's not made in other places. What is that argument?
Yeah, I'd make a couple of arguments that are unique and don't fit in the historiography. Some of them we'll get into later in the questions, but just to highlight sort of the broad strokes, I was able to do exclusive and unique interviews during my time with the Ronald Reagan administration. Anthony and I even had the pleasure of doing them at the same time, a couple of them. And they allowed me to show how personalities and human agency drove the INF story from a U.S. perspective. I was able to get wonderful anecdotes that were not available in the archives too, and I was able to make new arguments. One of the new arguments that I really developed is that the Ronald Reagan administration was quite serious about the zero-option proposal, a proposal to eliminate U.S. and Soviet intermediate-range ground-based nuclear missiles. In fact, it fit with Reagan's overarching goal of reducing and ideally eliminating nuclear weapons in the White House. So the interviews were really crucial to writing this book.
So, of course, you've got me thinking about several different follow-up questions to ask, and I promise we'll have time for Q&A. There's several people in this audience that worked on the issue, but also studied the issue themselves. Interviews. This is a great opportunity to spotlight the value of a Reagan postdoc, a Reagan Institute postdoc. Those interviews that you can get with members of the administration or allies of the administration that you can't really get anywhere else. You and I have talked about this. That last week of George Shultz's life, you got a chance. And I think, I'd be fairly comfortable making this assertion that you were probably the last person to interview Secretary Shultz.
Yeah, that's right. He passed about 5 days after our interview.
Yeah. And what was that experience like? I mean, someone who has lived through a lot of things, who knows he doesn't have much time left and is yet sitting down with a young scholar working on a book. I mean, what does that kind of tell you about the Reagan administration, the people who staffed it?
It was an honor to get to talk with Secretary Shultz, and honestly, I was quite humbled that he took the time out of his schedule, especially at that stage of his life, to chat with me. So one, it was just neat to be in the virtual room with him, getting to pick the brain of one of the key players in the INF negotiations. And the other thing is he offered me some great quotes that appear throughout the book, and you got to save some of the best quotes for places like the introduction. Yeah. I think one of the first quotes I used is he called the INF Treaty a wonderful deal. He called it the beginning of the end of the Cold War, and that's an argument that has a lot more resonance and salience when Secretary Shultz says it than I do without those quotation marks. And he also shed light on Reagan's motivation for, again, proposing the zero option. He said it was, quote, Reagan's way of getting the SS-20s out of Europe. And it's powerful evidence. It was impressive that he recalled some of the issues with such clarity. And it was really neat to get to chat with him.
Now, okay, so we talked about getting the SS-20s out of Europe. I promise I've read more than just the introduction. But in the introduction, you have a section, continuity and change.
Yeah.
And you talk a little bit about, what's the same between Reagan and Carter, but what's different between Reagan and Carter? Believe it or not, here at the Reagan Institute, we like to think there's a little difference between 39 and 40. And so what is different? What changes between the Carter administration and the Reagan administration?
Yeah, I often joke. I mean, anytime I talk about Jimmy Carter in the halls of the Reagan Institute, I do feel a little guilty. So we should certainly focus on number 40. The INF Treaty reflects Reagan's unique thinking about nuclear arms control. And there are two ways that you see this that are radical departures from the policies of the Carter administration. The first is the verification regime. Jimmy Carter and his aides, they probably would have accepted a deal that relied on national technical means, which is a fancy way of saying reconnaissance satellites, which is how they verified agreements like SALT. And in contrast, from almost the first day the negotiations began, Ronald Reagan is pressing for unprecedented on-site inspections. And that is a defining feature of the INF Treaty. It's something that later Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Soviet Union, is going to accept. But it is quintessential Ronald Reagan distrust of the Soviet Union. And then more important than that, the Carter administration rejected the zero option as a viable policy course. They thought that offering to eliminate weapons that had not yet been put into Europe in exchange for dismantling hundreds of operational Soviet missiles that were already in the field, it was going to deadlock the talks, it was going to allow public opinion to turn against the United States, and the SS-20 buildup would continue. And in contrast, President Ronald Reagan and his aides, they did not, or actually a better way to put it would be President Ronald Reagan never strayed from the long-term goal of eliminating intermediate-range nuclear forces, and that is reflected in the agreement.
So we talked about this. What are some moments of temptation in the desert for Reagan? When might he have abandoned the idea of actually reducing nuclear weapons rather than, putting some high ceiling on it that we can all race to?
Yeah.
And you talked about Walk in the Woods proposal, which, for those of you who don't know, also was a very dramatic moment that got turned into a Broadway play with Obi-Wan Kenobi as the lead, as Paul Nitze.
That's right.
And so, why was the Walk in the Woods proposal so tempting on the surface, and why did Reagan reject it?
Yeah, and I think that is a great litmus test to reveal the Reagan administration's negotiating strategy. The Walk in the Woods deal is Paul Nitze. He's the chief U.S. INF negotiator. He has strict instructions from Reagan in Geneva: do not stray from the zero option. But he'd been a negotiator in SALT under Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. He grew frustrated with Kissinger's exacting control, and Nitze wanted to do horse trading. And so without authorization from the president, him and the Soviet negotiator, they went up the mountains in a stylish Mercedes-Benz. They probably walked around a little bit when they got up there.
Yeah.
And they crafted a deal that would have put numerical limitations on how many INF-type missiles the United States and its allies the United States could deploy in Europe and the Soviet Union too. And it would have included aircraft. And I make the case, based on interviews with people in the Carter administration's NSC, that the Carter administration probably would have considered and maybe even accepted this deal. But it's not the one that Ronald Reagan wants. It's not ambitious enough for him. He didn't think Nitze should be able to negotiate without his permission. And we talked about this earlier too. Reagan was confident that once the missiles went into Europe in 1983 fall, he would later be able to get a better deal. And he is patient, and that is a major theme of the story, is that Reagan's patience bears fruit. And some of it's that Mikhail Gorbachev comes into office and changes the situation. But you can't blame Reagan for playing the cards that he was dealt so well, I don't think.
So it needs to be patience, peace, through strength.
I think that is a good addition to it.
We'll work on the name change at the center. We can continue to go in for more questions, but I do want to open it up to Q&A from the audience pretty soon.
Sure.
I'm going to ask one more question. 2019, INF Treaty had been considered the gold standard in arms control. Well, in 2019, it's no more. Seems like your book has some lessons, some resonance for what's going on in today, especially given the tests that NATO is facing. What are we to take away from this? What can we apply?
Yeah, I think that it's important when you're doing contemporary history to think about what lessons can be derived to help contemporary policymakers. And that's something that I emphasized and learned at Ohio University's Contemporary History Institute, at the RAND Corporation, and here at the Ronald Reagan Institute too. So I think there are lessons that contemporary policymakers who want to constrain Russian and Chinese ground-based intermediate range missiles can learn from the experience of negotiating the initial INF Treaty. One of the first lessons is that you want to have a simple approach to arms control. And in this case, I think that the Biden administration and its potential successor should consider bilateral negotiations with Russia and China instead of trilateral. And in those talks, pursue separate deals about different types of weapons. The more weapons, the more number of countries that you try and ram into the negotiations, the more complicated that it gets. And one of the INF breakthroughs occurs because Mikhail Gorbachev agrees to pursue a separate INF deal. He decouples it from the talks about SDI and missile defenses. He decouples it from strategic nuclear forces, and it allows for this breakthrough. So I think that's one thing to learn. I think a second one is you got to have something to trade for what the other side wants. Now, the United States today, the Army and the Marines, they have ground-based SM-6s and Tomahawks that they are putting somewhere into the Indo-Pacific. At this point, it looks like it's probably going to be places like Guam, Hawaii, and Alaska, which are U.S. territory, because the countries in the first island chain, the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan, they don't want these weapons on their territory. So the Biden administration needs to think about what it would like to trade for Russian and Chinese missiles. And if it wants to deploy these weapons on allied territory, it needs to understand that's going to be very difficult to negotiate, and it's going to anger the Xi and Putin governments. And then last but not least, I think it's important to remember today's unique context as well, and not just take the exact tactics from the 1980s and expect them to work in the 2020s. U.S. policymakers are not going to be talking with Gorbachev. Gorbachev shared Reagan's dream of a nuclear-free world. The Chinese economy is much stronger than the Russian economy in the 1980s, which created circumstances that encouraged Gorbachev to cave to Reagan's demands. And there are a number of countries today that have ground-based ballistic, cruise, conventional missiles, and I'm skeptical that the Chinese and Russians would agree to eliminate all of those weapons under a new zero-option type proposal. But that said, I still think it is worth pursuing meaningful arms talks with those countries.
Okay, this again sounds like patience, peace through strength. Okay, well, a lot of smart people in the audience, so why don't we turn it over to Q&A at this point from the folks in the room. And some of my colleagues will walk around with mics if anyone has a question. Unless you just really nailed it. Toshi over here, if you could just say where you're from, that'd be great.
Is it good? Sorry. Hi, my name is Toshi Higuchi. I'm from Georgetown University. Thank you so much. I heard about your project actually through multiple people, so I'm so excited to see it out now. My question is this: whenever I teach the end of the Cold War, the question is, why did the Cold War end? And then often nowadays, the explanations goes like, oh, it's because of economy, because of human rights. Yeah. Often, we don't actually no longer talk about nuclear aspects at all. So wondering what you have to say about in what ways actually this INF, and then other kind of nuclear issues actually contribute to the end of the Cold War.
Thank you so much for coming. It is an important question, and it's often in teaching that we're able to think about our own research and how we're going to answer those questions. I think that nuclear arms control does play an important role in ending the Cold War, and the INF Treaty is the first step on that journey. I mean, Gorbachev wrote himself that, to paraphrase, it was one of the first well-prepared steps out of the Cold War. And he said that the United States and Soviet Union would not have been able to sign subsequent disarmament agreements without it, like START. So I think it paves the way. I also think that INF and the verification regime is important to the trust building between the two countries. It allows for over 600 on-site inspections that were totally unprecedented in the United States, in Europe, and in Russia. And that reflects that newfound trust that was cultivated between Reagan and Gorbachev. And then the other thing I'll add to that is that Reagan and Gorbachev thought nuclear weapons and arms control was paramount. It's what they bring up at summits. It's what they often prioritize. And if the two leaders who are making decisions that are ultimately going to contribute to the end of the Cold War think it's important, I think it is as well.
Surely we have another question. There's a dissertation advisor in the room. The defense never ends with a dissertation advisor in the room. Chester.
Luke and I know each other very well. Maybe Luke thinks he knows me all too well. But, Chester Patch of Ohio University. You made a point about how President Reagan took the zero option seriously. That implies that there were people who didn't or were skeptical of it. So what I'd like you to do is talk about what your work, what your book adds to a long debate about President Reagan's relationship with his advisors. What have you contributed to that theme?
That's a great question. And that's a big part of the book is how much is Reagan the one making the decisions? How much is it that his aides are the ones influencing him to do it? I think one of the things that I establish in the book is that on major arms control decisions, Reagan is often in the driver's chair. And at times, he is rejecting the counsel of some of the people who have been portrayed to monopolize theater nuclear issues. Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Perle is a good example. It's been suggested by some scholars that he makes basically every meaningful decision about arms control. But in the book, I show on a couple different occasions, Perle suggests he should break off the INF talks after the destruction of Korean Airlines flight, and Reagan doesn't do it. He does the exact same thing when he suggests that they should terminate the talks after martial law is imposed in Poland. So I think it speaks a little bit to who's making the decisions. I also think that I show that what's happening in the early years of the Reagan administration is that Reagan's being presented with two very different paths by his aides on the zero option. The Defense Department and Richard Perle, it's all or nothing. It's zero option, or the negotiations are deadlocked and we're putting the missiles in Europe. And the State Department wants flexibility. It wants a proposal to reduce INF to the lowest possible level that the Soviet Union can accept. And so what Reagan's allowing in the early years of his administration, or whether or not he's allowing it, what it's resulting in is there's infighting, and then Reagan needs to step in and ultimately settle the debate and pick the policy. So I think on who's making the decisions, as well as what those precise prescriptions really are, I think I've added something to the historiography.
Luke, would you say that's something that you developed when you were at the Institute, or after, before?
Yeah, so that's great. Thank you for teeing me up, Anthony.
It's my job.
Absolutely, it is your job. Yeah, at the Reagan Institute, in large part because of my interviews with people like Richard Perle, I was able to develop the argument that it really is a take it or leave it proposal, and he would have preferred the Soviets to take the zero option. The zero option would have killed the SS-20 program. If you do numerical limitations, right, they're allowed to have just one SS-20 missile. They can have an active program of testing and development, none of which would have been the case under the zero option. So it's something that I developed at the Reagan Institute, in large part based on those interviews, is that the Reagan administration was quite serious about the zero option because it was going to produce a deal that was in the benefit of the United States and its allies.
Matt.
Matt Frakes from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Similar lines. Matt Frakes from Johns Hopkins SAIS. I wonder if you could say a bit more along similar lines about the role of the Defense Department and Cap Weinberger in developing both the missiles that were deployed as well as the eventual INF Treaty.
Yeah, they are. I present in chapters 4 through 6, the DoD's position is somewhat consistent. It's zero or no deal, and they do not bend on it. So that's a big part of the story. Another part that I was able to develop in greater detail, and the author Strobe Talbot got at in Deadly Gambits a little bit, is that the Defense Department, and Pearl in particular, they do not think that these missiles have much military utility. He says at one point that the Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles, quote, were not worth a damn. He thought they were expensive. He understood that they were vulnerable to Soviet preemption. They put them on existing aircraft shelters instead of building new hardened silos, which would have in theory increased the survivability of these weapons. But it's ultimately politics that drove the basing program in the 1970s. So they are quite willing to trade those missiles, in my opinion, away for the SS-20s because they don't think they're very useful. And the result is the INF Treaty, Gorbachev has to get rid of 4 times more deployed warheads than Reagan. And the SS-20s posed a dire threat to the United States and its Western European allies. So I actually think that the Defense Department's position throughout this process is quite clever, and they're very good at framing their recommendations in a way that resonates with Reagan's deep-seated distrust of the Soviet Union.
All right, well, I think everyone's eager to get a copy signed with a glass of champagne in hand. So please join me all in thanking Dr. Luke Griffith, for this wonderful book.